everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Light After Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Alyssa Scolari. And today we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Jan Canty. Dr. Canty was born, raised, and educated in and widowed in Detroit. 2 months shy of completing her postdoctoral fellowship, her husband of 11 years went missing. 2 weeks later, he was found murdered. That event separated her life into before and after segments. Due to media pressure, she moved, changed her name, and did not speak of it for 30 years. When she came out of the shadows, she wrote a book called A Life Divided and started a podcast for other so-called homicide survivors called Domino Effect of Murder. So this is quite the harrowing story that we have today. So with all of that said, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Canty herself. Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really glad we connected. Happy to have you on the show. Happy to have you here. I know we're talking about some tough stuff today.
Yes.
Even, reading your bio alone was just like, oh man, there's so much here. I guess I'll start with, take me through like your journey. So you were married. How long were you married for?
I was married to Al for 11 years before he went missing.
Okay. And what was life like prior to that?
I would say pretty steady. He was very supportive of my career aspirations, and we were doing okay financially. He was 18 years older than me. And the reason I mention that is because when he began at the very end of that 11-year period to seem more removed or tired or preoccupied, I attributed it wrongly to his health, thinking, well, he's older, he needs a physical, but instead he was up to his eyebrows in trouble and not telling me because he had befriended two people in downtown Detroit that he allowed them, encouraged them, in fact, to take advantage of him financially. And he did this for 18 months. And when he ran out of money, they murdered him.
So here you are. You're married, it looks like you were doing you were in graduate school going for your PhD.
I'd completed my PhD at that point, and I was going through my 2-year postdoctoral fellowship. I was in the last 2 months of it when it all happened. Okay.
So all this time you're thinking like, well, it's just that Al is really, his health is declining because, of his age.
Mm-hmm.
When really what was happening is he essentially had like another life where he
was pretending to be a physician by the name of Dr. Miller. I found this all out in talking with the chief inspector of homicide the day they called me down to interview me. I had no knowledge of anything that he'd been up to. And one of the many things that he said to me was, go home and look at your finances and you're probably broke. And that was kind. I mean, when I looked into our finances, this is in 1985 dollars, I was $30,000 in debt. So that translates into about $90,000 today.
Oh my gosh.
We were behind on taxes, rent at the office, mortgage payments, health insurance, you name it. It was way overdue because he'd been giving these two people all of our money and more. He'd even bought cars for them. He'd paid their rent. He even gave them a scrapbook or a photo album that I had assembled for insurance purposes of the interior of our house with the estimated value of each of the larger items in the house. And in case there was a fire, I could just grab it and I'd have evidence of what we owned and it would be easy to turn into the insurance company. He even gave that to them. So they had the knowledge of what was in the house as well as the layout.
So your whole world, like every aspect of your world got turned upside down in a matter of a week.
He was missing a week. So between the time he didn't come home and the time I met with Inspector Gil Hill, I was like just pacing and worrying and trying to figure out what happened. And then he called me down a week later after he'd been missing and told me that he suspected he'd been murdered, but he didn't have a body yet. And then back in 85, you needed that to have a prosecution. But he had a fair idea what had happened. I now know he had a whole lot more evidence than he was telling me. But then it was the following week, almost to the day, that he called me down and said that they had unearthed his shallow grave in northern Michigan. He had been killed by the way of a baseball bat and then dismembered. So they had buried his identifiable body parts in a bog in northern Michigan called the University of Michigan Biologics Station. That's an area where they do scientific research, mosquitoes. And to do that, they have roadkill dumped there. So it was a perfect camouflage for where they buried him. And I really believe that had an informant, an accomplice in the burial not come forward, they would have never figured it out.
Yeah. So that's what happened. Somebody came forward with that tip.
Yep. To escape prosecution. He wanted immunity from prosecution in order to give the information. And they made a deal with him saying, yes, if you can lead us to the body parts, you will be off the hook. And you will have to testify in court, though, against the two defendants, which was John Carl Fry and Dawn Marie Spence. And he agreed to all of it. And they held up their bargain as well. So that's what happened.
And in the months after, well, because I'm sure there was an entire criminal, I'm sure a trial took place. Are these people now in jail?
They were at the time. And on that point, I'll say that only 5% of murders go to trial. 95% are plea bargains. So that was a concern that I had, is that they all plea bargained to more information that the police wanted, and it could have ended in something minor, because there was evidence that he knew a lot more about other murders in Detroit. But they didn't plea bargain. He did go to trial and they were convicted. John Carl Fry was convicted of first-degree murder and convicted to life without parole, which is the maximum in Michigan at the time. I think it's still the same. However, his accomplice, Dawn Marie Spence, was given a very light sentence, and she was out before I could even sell my house.
What?
Yeah. Because she didn't do the actual killing. She just helped transport the body parts. So they charged her and convicted her of, I think the wording is something like mutilation of a dead body or something like that. And so she was off pretty quickly. I think she served 2 years, maybe 18 months. It was really brief. And then he died in prison after 5 years of Hep C. So he's no longer around. She still is. And she's been out. She went back to school and she's alive and well.
That makes me want to throw up. It truly does.
There was a public outcry when the public became aware of her light sentence, but it's a done deal. You can't make a judge change his mind.
Right. So then for you, after all of that, between having to grieve and being in shock, I'm sure you made that decision to change your name, move completely out of the area.
Eventually, because I tried moving locally and the media would not leave me alone. I had to change my phone number so often I had to write it down to make sense of it. And they were coming to my workplace. People were driving by my house. It was always in the press. Any little thing, like John Carl Fry escaped one time while he was incarcerated. So it drummed it all up again. And when he died, it drummed it all up. And I just thought, I'm leaving. I've had it. I don't want to, this isn't my swan song. I don't want to forever be known as the widow. This isn't how I want my life to unfold at this point. It was hard. I loved living where I did. My practice was taking off. It was a goal I'd worked for over a decade, and it was working, but I wasn't happy and I was on edge all the time. And I was tired of people pointing at me in public. And finally, I just said enough. And so to your point about grief, because of all the drama, the media, my health risks, I was told I had to get an HIV test because of his infidelity with prostitutes. There were so many irons in the fire at any given time that grief was totally postponed for a long time. That was a luxury. I didn't have time to process it. I was constantly putting out fires. If it wasn't the media, it was bills. If it wasn't the bills, it was my health. If it wasn't that, it was moving. If it wasn't that, it was something else. So it kept getting postponed. It was one of those things I thought later, I can deal with that later. Right now, I got to figure out, in the early weeks, frankly, I had to figure out how I was going to eat, how I was going to keep the lights on, because he'd given away all our money and we were in debt, and I had just started my practice. So my income was very low.
Right.
So I started selling things that I owned to not only prepare to move to a smaller place, but to survive. And winter was setting in, and I was worried about the heat bill because it was a really old house and it sucked up energy. So my mind was consumed with survival for a long time.
Right. It's, as you were talking about, you couldn't really even go anywhere or do anything without the media. Oh, of course, I think to myself, like, there's no way you even had 2 seconds to grieve.
No.
As you said, like, that's a luxury, right? Yeah. Like, I'm in survival mode. There's no time to process any of this.
I postponed what I could postpone, and that was one of them. I had to prioritize. I had to make my bills. I had to eat. I had to figure out how I was going to heat the house. I had to try to sell the house. And that was an issue because Michigan law, even to this day, states that if there is a serious crime in which the owner of the house is involved, even if it does not take place on the property, you have to divulge that information to the potential buyer in case they are superstitious. If you fail to do that, they can rescind the offer at any time in the future. So that devalued the house.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, is that just me, or does that seem like an absolutely...
It was like one thing on top of another. Like I said, it made no sense to me because it didn't occur in the house. So I didn't think it, but everybody knew anyway, because the media published pictures of our house and even a map to get to our house. So it really wasn't a secret in the sense, but the people that ended up buying the house came from England. So they would not have known anything about this, but they still had to be told about it. And so as a consequence, the house was probably valued by a third less of what it was worth. And I used a lot of that money just to pay off bills.
I feel like I've been shaking my head so much throughout this interview already that my head might actually spin off. I'm baffled that a law like that even exists.
Yeah, I checked recently and it's still there.
Unbelievable. Right. As if things weren't, it's like you had everything working against you all at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
How did you stay sane?
I attribute a lot of my coping skills, number one, to how my parents raised me. They were never, ever one to allow me to escape responsibility. And if I complained, they'd always point out, somebody has it worse than you. Come on, get on with life. You don't have it so bad. That was a factor in my childhood. My parents flew in from Phoenix to be with me, and they were immense help. My dad took care once they arrived, which was a week into his disappearance. My dad took charge of the front door and the phone. My mom took charge of laundry and cooking because I hadn't eaten. And in fact, the dinner that I had prepared for Al and I the night he was to come home, I'd left it on the stove for a week. I hadn't even noticed it. That's how out of it I was. It was hamburger. We were going to have hamburgers that night. And it just was sitting in the summer heat for a week. And I didn't even notice it. So the minute she walked in the house, she's like, what in the God's name is that odor? That stinks.
You didn't even notice it.
And I hadn't had a shower because it wasn't like a week. It was like one very long day. That's how it felt to me. There was no morning, noon, and night, 24-hour cycles. It was like the next hour, the next minute, the next hour. And it just kept going. And I was getting by on cat naps for a long time. So it didn't seem like a week but that they came. It seemed like one very long day. Morning, noon, and night had no meaning at all.
I think that that's a deeply accurate description of the traumatic loss, like what that trauma is like in the initial phases. Like that's what it is. It's, a week went by and I felt like a day. Like I think, that's a perfect way of describing it. And
well, I think you're so into your own skin, those external benchmarks are gone. You don't know the date, you don't know the hour, you don't know the it's
None of that even
morning, noon, or
matters.
night. You don't. You're so inside your own skin and thinking about what's happened and what needs to happen that's all very external, very removed and meaningless at that time.
Yeah, it's like none of that even matters. You
No.
know, the date, the day, the time, it's all right. None of, like you said,
Right.
the external just doesn't matter. Now, for you, when did the grieving process, like when did you transition? Was it when you moved, like from that shock to the grief?
Well, I would say in earnest, it was after I left Michigan. It was probably a year and a half later.
Okay.
Because up to that point, I was just treading water. And finally, when I got away from everybody I knew, all the reporters, the media, the police, and I could sit and think. Even at the funeral, I couldn't think because the media were there. I mean, they were so intrusive, so invasive and impersonal and in my face. I couldn't even grieve all I could think about at the funeral was getting out of there and getting home.
Yeah.
They had cameras and microphones, and it was like a circus. I felt like all that was missing was popcorn.
Oh, a circus you don't want to be at.
No.
Not at all.
So it was a long time, and I was pretty removed from it all by then. And I did not have a name for the kind of grief that I was experiencing at the time. But now looking back, I know that it's a unique kind of, well, maybe it's more common than we think. It's called conflicted grief, where there is relief in your grief, where there's some element of, I'm glad that's over. I know I wouldn't want him back because of all the deceit, all the infidelity, endangering my life.
Yes.
Let alone his own.
Yes.
There was this anger like I had never experienced in my life. You still have the other typical parts of grief, the sadness and the feeling empty and remembering the good times. That's still all there. But in addition to that, there's this other layer of how dare you? How dare you have done what you did to your life and my life and our life? What was wrong with you? And so that conflicted grief for me, and I'm not saying this is everybody, but for me, made it easier because you don't go to that depth of soul searching and mourning because your anger bottoms you out. It's at a point where, if he had lived, if he had survived, I would have left him in a heartbeat. I mean, I wouldn't have put up with that.
Right.
So it made it easier for me. And I took it a day at a time again when that happened. I wish I'd had a name for it then. All I know is I felt terribly guilty for not feeling more sad, more mournful than I did, that I was able to start sleeping soon. And, you go in the Hallmark section of a card area and you'll see, they're still with you in your thoughts and you will be together one day. None of that applied to me. It was like, I don't want to walk with him again. I don't want to be with him at some future time. Yeah.
You're mad as hell.
And there's no place to discharge it because he's not here.
Right. You can't even scream at him.
No. And his mother really was in denial. It was his only child. And so my mother-in-law was like feeding it. Like, I bet, she even sent me an anniversary card.
What?
After a few months after he left, after he died. And she was like not in touch with what was going on. She refused to believe his role in his own demise and always said he'd been blackmailed. There was another explanation, but she would not go to court. She would not go to the police station. She would not face any of the facts as we knew them. So she could continue to live in that sense of denial. And at her age, I thought, let her. What's the difference? It's her only child. She's entitled to see it how she needs to see it, if that makes her sleep. But I don't want to be a part of it. And so, there's an old saying that murder kills not just victims, it kills families too. And that's a good example of that.
It's so true. So true. Now, but for you, it didn't kill you.
No.
And it sounds like it's partially because it's like you said, that type of conflict grief, right? You have all this rage, this anger, because there's this sense of betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
But you also, like, even just reading your bio and seeing where you're at now, you've now kind of incorporated the past and what happened to you into the work that you do now.
Yes, I do. It took me 30 years to speak of it. I did not talk about it for a long, long time after I moved. But there were specific events that happened that made me come out of the shadows. And when it did, I had enough objectivity there. The dust had settled. I had gotten my ducks in a row. I'd deliberately done things to get myself back on track, because back in 1985, you're alone. There is no internet. There's no way to search out. I didn't even know the name homicide survivor then. All I knew is I didn't know a soul who'd been through what I'd been through.
Yeah.
So it was up to me to deal with it as best I could and figure out how I was going to heal myself. So I fell back on a very old model that I was taught in my training, which is you look at biopsychosocial dimensions of behavior. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I've got to address each of those. I got to look at what I'm doing biologically. So I started doing triathlons. I started looking at things socially. I traveled around the world and went to remote villages and visited and helped communities in very remote places who didn't even have drinking water, let alone a spouse. Women had no rights, and it was, bug infested. And I tried to throw myself into helping other people who were less fortunate in some ways than myself. That put it in perspective. And I tried to heal myself psychologically by trying to read up on it. Once the internet came into being and I could get resources, I started researching a little bit more about homicide survivors. And even now, there's not a ton of information, but it's better than it used to be. And so that was my focus, was to say, life, strangely, has prepared me for this. I've got my formal training and I have my life training. And my goal now is to help other homicide survivors and people close to homicide survivors, like perhaps a close friend of somebody who's lost someone to homicide. My goal is to help that population deal with their experience, because there's very little out there now. There's no parades in our honor. There's no national day that people are aware of, for homicide survivors. And we're misrepresented in movies, if we're represented at all. Yeah. Because most of the time the focus is on the crime and the perpetrator, and maybe a trial, which is a myth, because like I said, most of the time it's a plea bargain. But as for the family of the deceased, they're just in the background. They're this fleeting people that are dissolved into tears, and then they lead them off stage, and that's it. And that's where the story starts. That's not where it ends. So my goal has been to try to fan the flames of that and create better understanding and a pool of resources for people in that situation.
And that is largely what your book is about? A Life Divided? Or is that more of like a memoir?
Both. It's both. It's a true crime memoir, but I segue it into, my deliberate intent was to segue at the end towards speaking to trauma survivors in general, so that you can use my story as a springboard to understand what goes on with trauma, so that people can use it for their own benefit. Like, for example, I talk about nightmares as not something to fear. That's a part of the healing process, and it's natural and it's inevitable, and it's your mind trying to reset itself. And this is one silly example, but there's that. And then also the podcast, it was actually suggested to me by a relative in South Carolina who owns a crime scene cleanup business. And it was her idea to say, you'd be a perfect person to have a podcast. And I'm thinking, I don't know anything about podcasts, the technology, pop filter, the whole, there's a lot, as an uphill of information you have to gather. But as you probably know, Alyssa, other podcasters are very helpful. It's like a nice community.
It's a nice community. It is.
They're not competitive. They're helpful. And they really helped me get on my feet. So that's how the Domino Effect of Murder was born. And that was 2 years ago. And it's now heard in 11 countries.
Wow. That's incredible.
And I've met the most remarkable people. That's been so enjoyable. It's like my tribe. That's what I think of them. These are people that went through every homicide is unique. They're all different, but these are people that somehow figured out a way to make lemonade out of lemons, and I admire them. They're resilient. They're creative. They're compassionate. They're passionate and articulate and willing to talk about their histories. And, I just admire them and I enjoy speaking with them.
Yes. And you are one of those people. I mean, you truly are. And it's, the kind of grief and the kind of traumatic loss that you have been through. I think the grief expert, David Kessler, who is just one of my all-time favorite people on the planet, he wrote the book called Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief. And I believe he has an entire chapter dedicated to homicide. And it is because it is a much different type of grief.
And it's a grief that, one of the sad things about it is that when you start to knit together, when you start to pull yourself out of this, that's about the time the trial happens or the court proceedings. And it just opens it up again. And anytime you see somebody in the news who died under very similar circumstances as your loved one, it opens it up. So that's another part that makes it hard. When I hear of somebody who's lost a loved one, they're missing, and then they're found murdered, it just rips at me.
Yeah. It's like this wound that just, you can't get medical attention for. It's just a wound that weeps.
Yeah.
And there's no healing. And, one of the questions I'm very curious to ask your opinion on this. There has been such a trend towards true crime. And I don't know if it's specifically in this country or if it's worldwide. People are obsessed with true crime. Myself included, right? Myself included. I listen to many, many, many true crime podcasts. And I think that there's been a lot of criticism that people are obsessed with it in a way that almost minimizes the tragedy. Do you feel that that's the case? Have you noticed that people more so like are all about the drama of it and less like aware of like, no, this is homicide. Like this is devastating and life altering?
I think you see an array. There are some podcasts which make light of it. My favorite podcast, one is Wine and Crime, and they even laugh, and it trivializes it.
Yes.
And in addition to that, it doesn't focus on the aftermath. It focuses on the crime itself, which is very common. But there are a handful out there that do bring up and do try to address the victims who are living. They're in the minority, but they're there. And I don't think they were even there 5 years ago. So that's refreshing.
Yeah.
What I find equally upsetting for me is the lack of interest in scholarly research on homicide survivors. Because here's a for instance. When I do my episodes, I always research, I guess it's the research for me, but I always try to research the topic I'm going to be specifically addressing in that episode. Mm-hmm. One week, I was going to be speaking with a young woman. She was like in her mid-20s, maybe late 20s at the most, who was a filicide survivor, meaning that her mother murdered her brother. Filicide is the murdering of one's child. She survived it.
I didn't know that.
And so I thought, okay, I want to research filicide, and particularly what's the impact on the surviving child, because it's not like the Watts case. They're not always where all the children are killed. It's unique. There's differences. I could not find one shred of data, one study anywhere in the world that talked about this. That's just one example, but it's not unique. And so, but if you look up serial killers, oh my God, you don't have enough room to read all the articles. Yes. So academia is following that same, mode. Is like, can't you get off the subject of serial killers and the homicide itself and look at the aftermath? There's so much we need to know. What's the impact on development of children who witness a homicide, or what's the impact of an older child if he sees his parent murder a younger child? We don't know because nobody's researching these things.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And movies, they don't show the reality of it very often either. There's only a very few films out there that start with the trial and then proceed to show the people's life afterwards. They're definitely in the minority, which I don't totally blame the academicians and the producers and the podcast hosts for this, because homicide survivors tend to run and hide. We don't like the spotlight. We don't want to talk about it. It took me 30 years to talk about it. So it's not just them not giving us thought, but we run from the spotlight too. And so you put the two together and there's this big unknown. But I will tell you this, that it's an equal opportunity club, and at any moment, anybody can join us. You just never know. Whether it's a mass homicide or an individual suicide homicide, you don't know until it happens to you.
Exactly. I thank you for that. And I thank you for your honesty, because I see that and I open my eyes to it. And listen, I am no angel in this. I myself am reading about, The Stranger Beside Me, about Ted Bundy and, original Night Stalker, Golden State Killer. They recently caught him, but what are there books about,
But the thing that I think we need to underscore here is that I believe, and the research supports this, that many women in particular who follow true crime do so as a learning tool for their own safety. What do I need to know to avoid this happening to me? So it's not always a gossipy kind of mystery intrigue angle that they have. It's self-protection.
Absolutely. But I think that self-protection also can be extended to looking at the impact of the survivors, because we could easily as we could be a victim of homicide, that's as easily as we could be a survivor of homicide. Right?
I wish more people would see that.
Yeah. And it's, there are no books on, like you said,
one book, if I can plug it, I learned about it from my podcast. One of my guests wrote it, and it's a wonderful book. I wish if you're a police officer listening, get this book in your department to hand out at crime scenes of homicides. It's called What to Do When the Police Leave. And it's exactly what it's about. It's almost like a manual, like step A, step B. And it's been printed over 40,000 copies, but I think it should be, especially with the uptick in homicides in the last year. Homicides have nationally gone from an average of 18,000 annually to now 20,000 since COVID has hit.
Oh my God.
It's still rare. It doesn't mean it's frequent. It's like, if you picture a football stadium, we're now talking about 10 people in that football stadium as opposed to maybe 7 before, but still it happens.
Still significant. Yeah.
And that doesn't include always the bigger scale homicides, the mass tragedies. But I think that there are books like that out there. But this is it. The public doesn't know about this safety net. They don't know the resources that are out there. I'm still learning about them. And it's so darn hard to find them. And I wish there was a clearinghouse or a public, a nationwide conference or something that we could pull these resources together. Police, victims and attorneys and so on, and learn from one another to get a boost going so that the safety net is there and in place. The closest one I can find is through Arizona. The Arizona Homicide Inc., that's what they call it, INC, Homicide Inc.
is probably a conference.
It's an organization within Arizona. They have support groups, they have pamphlets, they have speakers, and they're probably, from where I sit, it looks like the most organized and probably one of the earliest. The other one is Parents of Murdered Children. They're in both in the United States and Canada. They're very organized, and it is, despite what the name sounds like, they are open to speaking with people other than parents.
Okay,
but there aren't many. There's very, very few, and I'm hoping that through your podcast and people listening here, as well as my own, that people will become more aware of resources out there.
Yes. And I will absolutely link your book, your podcast, as well as the What to Do When the Police Leave book in the show notes for the listeners.
It's written by Bill Jenkins,
Bill Jenkins. Okay.
Whose son was murdered. One thing also, if I could just touch on quickly, I know we're running out of time, but
oh yeah, go ahead.
If I could speak to some of the other myths surrounding one, I've already mentioned that frequently murders end in trial. That's like CSI stuff on TV.
Yeah.
That isn't the case. 95% of them end up in a plea bargain. So be prepared for the murderer of your loved one to get a lesser offense charge. The other one is that once a homicide occurs, that the people who are the grieving people are going through it, that they receive a lot of support. And that doesn't usually happen except at the time of the funeral and maybe at the time of the trial, but it quickly falls off. And therefore, one of the recommendations I would make is if you knew somebody that had this happen to, and you're close to them, stay in touch with them over the next few months. They're going to need you to be there for them, month 5, month 6, and the year anniversary of the murder.
Yeah.
The other misperception is that once people are convicted of homicide, that they serve very long sentences, and that too is false. Nationally, if you are convicted of a first-degree premeditated murder, the national average, and it does vary by jurisdiction, is 17 years.
Ugh.
If you are convicted of second-degree impulsive murder, the national average is only 5 years, 9 months. That's involuntary manslaughter is 9.2 years. So it's really not what you think. We don't have these life sentences. About 2% of murder convictions are false convictions. That is, an innocent person has been railroaded into giving a false confession and put behind bars. And there's a man I met, he was a guest on my episode, called Deskovic is his last name, Jeffrey Deskovic. He was a teenager who was interrogated over many hours and just given caffeine, finally admitted to falsely confessed to a murder of his classmate and served 16 years before he was released. He's now an attorney himself and helps other exonerees get their day in court. Another myth is that women are at greatest risk when they are alone outside after dark. And what the data shows is that the most common place for women to be murdered is their own home. And the most common perpetrator is someone close to them. It could be an ex-boyfriend, could be a neighbor, but it's somebody known to them. It's not the stranger pulling them into a van and dumping them in the woods. That happens, but that's not the biggest risk. Most women are murdered in their home. And about 65% of murders are by people who know each other well. So family members, friends, coworkers are the 65% of all homicides are perpetrated by that group versus strangers, which is not how it's portrayed in the media very often.
No.
So there are other myths, but those are just ones I wanted to throw out.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for what you do. You truly embody, I think, the word resiliency. You embody what this podcast is really all about.
And if I can do it, other people can do it.
Yes.
You need to surround yourself with strong people. You need to pay attention to your biology, get your rest, get your hydration. You don't have to do marathons and triathlons, but you do have to get off your chair and go walk at least. To pay attention to your diet, ratchet down the cigarettes and the pop and the bad stuff. Take care of yourself biologically. In fact, I would recommend you see a physician within the first weeks of a homicide. Take care of yourself socially. Don't become a hermit. I did that. It doesn't work well. Surround yourself with at least 1 or 2 close allies. They don't have to have been through what you've been through, but just to have them sit there and listen. They don't have to throw out any recommendations. There's no magic words they need to come up with, but just to sit there non-judgmentally and listen to you, whether it's 3 a.m. or whatever it is, and listen to them is very, very helpful. The other thing that friends can do, which is very helpful, especially in the early weeks, is do not say, call me if you need something, because people don't know what they need.
Right.
Instead say, I noticed you need to take your car in to get your tires rotated. I'm going to do that for you. Or you need to get your cat into the vet. I'll get that done for you. Or I'm going to grocery shop. I'm going to bring your groceries to you. Do something specific and concrete that they will benefit by. I had a friend whose husband suicided, and I know she was very worried. She kept talking about, how am I going to get my grass cut? Because she was not physically well. And so I purchased landscaping for that summer for her. And you'd think I'd given her $1 million. If I had said to her, call me if you need something, that would have never happened.
No, I have always felt, I hate that phrase so much. I have always seen it as a cop out. It might just be a personal thing. It might be, I think sometimes people feel uncomfortable. They don't know what to say. So then they say, just let me know if you need anything. And I feel like that's a cop out. Right. It's like, no, that person will not be able to tell you what they need. There are no words for this. No. Just look and go into action.
Yep.
And that's how you can be the best help.
Yep.
I mean, that's my spiel on that. That phrase always just frustrates me when there's like grief or loss. It's like, yes. No, because then it puts more pressure on the victim.
It does. You can't even make a decision.
Right. Like, man, like, what am I?
You're not looking at your life objectively. I mean, my mother comes in and sees a week old rotten hamburger. I mean, obviously I needed somebody to clean my kitchen, but I didn't notice.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So,
but because of people like you reaching out and allowing me to speak, I do feel more optimistic that more people will be helped.
Yes. Even just today, right? The week I'm having, listening to this, puts things into, I think, very serious perspective for me, but also helps me to know that people out there, myself included, can do very hard things and can take so much pain that we did not deserve. You did not deserve it. You didn't need it. You didn't ask for it. You didn't want it. You never saw it coming, but you took it after many, many years, as hard as it was. And now you are using it to help other people.
I think people are more capable of doing things than they even think they are.
Agreed.
You don't know until it happens what you're capable of.
1,010%. So I thank you so much for your vulnerability, for sharing your story. Everything will be linked in the bio for the listeners, so you can check all of that stuff out. And thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa, for having me on.
Thanks for listening, everyone. For more information, please head over to lightaftertrauma.com, or you can also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we are at lightaftertrauma, and on Twitter, it is at lightafterpod. Lastly, please head over to patreon.com/lightaftertrauma to support our show. We are asking for $5 a month, which is the equivalent to a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So please head on over again. That's patreon.com/lightaftertrauma. Thank you, and we appreciate your support.